I thought you were trying to speak. Okay, well then I'll take a couple of questions. Does anyone have a question for the panelists?
Yes, I do.
Okay, yes sir.
Where are issues from?
What was that?
Where were issues you from? Where
Well,
were you raised?
Well, that's a loaded question for me.
It's not like that.
No, well for me it is because I moved quite a bit, but I call Memphis home. I was born in Millington, but my family is from Mississippi. And we migrated as sharecroppers to Memphis. But I ended up living in Atlanta, Virginia, DC, a lot of different places, but I call Memphis home. So I'll say Memphis.
I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, and was in New Orleans. As soon as any of my friends got a car, we were in New Orleans as much as we could to see just all the music. Went to college in Mississippi, and then moved to Memphis.
I grew up through my college years in Massachusetts, though lived for 4 years as a boy in Dallas, Texas, and then moved back to Massachusetts, but then lived in California for grad school and some of my initial teaching, and finally wound up in Memphis for the last 32 years, so I guess I've been all over.
My parents and my whole family was from Mississippi, but they were in Indiana at the time I was born, but only lived there for 6 weeks and moved back. So I grew up in Biloxi, and Oxford, and Mobile. Mobile's mostly where I went to school. Lived in Memphis for a couple of years too, and then went to Chicago for college. And that's really, despite growing up where it all came from, I really didn't get into blues till that time when I was in Chicago and found out that Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and all those, Jimmy Reed, Otis Rush, all those guys were there. And not only were they there, they were all from Mississippi. So that was what made me appreciate where I came from more than anything else. So Chicago, then back to Clarksdale, and then now I'm in Kansas City.
I spent my first 20-some years in Virginia, and where I actually in the DC area got to know about Virginia traditions through John Jackson, Archie Edwards, Cephas and Wiggins. So I became very aware of that. Eventually became aware of the tradition. First they were just guys, but I ended up in Sweden for 8 years and actually moved back from where I edited a blues magazine, and then I ended up coming back to Mississippi where I've been. Came back to edit Living Blues magazine.
It looks like we've all been together. Josh, you have a question?
Yeah, actually, y'all were talking earlier about separating truth from fiction as far as blues is concerned, specifically with Selling Your Soul to David's Donut, which I thought was quite brilliant. But in a way, though, isn't that falsity, isn't that part of the heritage of the blues? Just what are y'all's thoughts on that?
Well, I think the storytelling is an art too, whether the stories are true or not, and it is part of the culture, like you say. And I think there's a place for that to be documented, but I don't think we want to say on a historical marker. Sometimes we can allude to those stories, but we really don't have the space to get into it all. But I think you know, in an article or an essay or a book, you can get into that more. But I think it's important, you know, and a lot of the tallest tales come from around here.
Well, yeah, just to think, but we do, what Jim said is, we like to write a lot, but actually we do have about 500 words on the markers and photographs. So we actually do have, and we've gotten pretty good at tackling a whole lot of information. And as I said, like with that Rosedale marker, we haven't been asked to put up a cross-surface marker at Abe's yet. But like so in Rosedale, that is part of the lore. We did a marker for Big Bill Brunzi in Scott, Mississippi, where he said for years that he was from. It turns out he probably was not from there. But it's likely that he picked Scott because that's where the Mississippi River broke through in 1827. It made for a better narrative when he was talking about Mississippi. So there's another case right now, I don't want to mention what it is, that we're dealing with somebody who said they were from one city, and it's questionable whether we can say Albert King, everybody's, you know, he said he's from Indianola. There's no evidence that he was from Indianola. There is evidence that his name was Albert Nelson or something else, and changed it to King, and then after somebody else famous named King, who was from Indianola. So that's part of the storytelling, and so to a certain degree, Albert King is famous for being from Indianola. So it's even worth noting, putting a marker up there and noting that he made Indianola doubly famous because he said he was from there. So yeah, we are addressing the folklore. We're not going and saying, no, this is BS. Right? It is part of the reality. With Bessie Smith, for instance, we had to deal with, no, she wasn't turned away from the White Hospital because the ambulance drivers never would have considered taking a black person to the White Hospital at the time, which is acknowledging that sort of racism, but it's sort of saying, well, the story about her being turned away at the door isn't quite correct. She was turned away systematically, but not in terms of an actual incident.
Well, there are myths from within the culture, and then there are myths that are created by outsiders, fans, or even researchers. I hate to say it sometimes, but I mean, for example, Louisiana Red, who's still with us very much. You would think he was from Louisiana, but in fact he was named after a hot sauce. He grew up in Alabama or born in Alabama and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
You actually know his story.
You know that's true. But he has also given people the impression that he had some connection with Louisiana or with Vicksburg, Mississippi.
Yeah, there's some evidence he lived in the same apartment complex as champion Jack Dupree in Hamburg, Germany, or Hanover, Germany. And like I think Red started saying that his parents were killed by the KKK or in a fire, which is what happened to Dupree. So there's a lot of sense of borrowing, and I think we've talked a lot about this when we interview artists, and particularly artists who've been interviewed a lot. They start, I don't want to say making things up because I don't want to question their veracity, but the interviews are a performance, and sometimes they're giving people what they want.
Well, anyone talking about themselves tends to be self-aggrandizing.
And you in particular.
Well, that totally ties into a story that actually my family had a story like that, and my uncle was a blues singer, Wilroy Sanders of the Fieldstones. David did a lot of work with our family, and we thank you for that because we haven't actually seen you in a while, but thank you so much for all that. But one of the stories surrounding our family was we had a farm right off Airways Boulevard, which the airport now owns pretty much all of that land. And so the story was that the barn got burned down because we were being run out of our place there, when in truth, Wilroy's father, my grandfather, had a, he was stilling whiskey in the back, he had a still, and it just blew up, and at some point they had to move as a result of the fire. But those kinds of things happen, and so for the longest time, we all thought that we were just, we were run out of that particular area of town. But I come to find out, later on, my cousin's like, well, let me just tell you the truth, there was a whiskey still back there. And so that kind of thing does happen in surface. But as we are shutting down the panel, I want to thank the panelists and ask for any closing remarks from you guys, starting with John.
I'm just thankful to be here in Helena. I'm glad that the institute, the college I work for, has been able to be a part of this. So I'm just appreciative of that.
I'll just make a shameless plug. I've got some of my books and CD productions that are out in front at the ticket counter that I'll be glad to show you if you want to take them home with you. And other than that, I've enjoyed being on the panel and wish the festival well. I understand it's going to be King Biscuit Festival.
Again, yes. It is now.
The fellows that came out are actually the King Biscuit Fellows.
The King Biscuit Fellows.
Yeah, the t-shirts printed up, so it's official, I guess.
Jim, any closing remarks?
No, well, thank you for inviting all of us to participate in this. It's great to be here in Helena. I've always felt a special attraction to Helena, and was here for the first blues festival. Actually, I was at Ole Miss at that point, and some people from Helena came to Ole Miss, said they wanted to start